Hello, it's Sean Mathias, and I'm sitting in the Grand Theatre in Swansea. It's we've just turned into 2023, and like the seagulls are singing away outside, and the sun is trying to peek through. And we're having some memories of all my various times here. I was born actually in the Uplands, right around the corner from where Dylan Thomas lived as a child. It was called the Beresford Nursing Home, and we started coming down. We lived in the Uplands for the first 6 years of my life, and my earliest memories are coming to the Panto, and I think we used to come quite often on a Boxing Day. It was a huge treat. We'd come down to the Panto on Boxing Day, and I can almost shiver now with the excitement of all the kids just giggling and screaming and being so thrilled to bits and running up and down the aisles, and the parents trying to keep the kids in the seats. And we couldn't be contained. We were just too thrilled and excited. And so I suppose that's my extraordinarily in Britain. It's happened to many of us, hasn't it? That's my introduction to theatre, pantomime. And I'm not sure who was in those first pantos. Maybe Stan Stennett. I know later on it was Ryan and Ronnie. That was a little bit later. And then I think when I was maybe only 10 or 11, I went into amateur drama. So I was in the Swansea Little Theatre. I was in the Alpha Players. I was in about 3 or 4 amateur groups. And suddenly I was hot to trot as a young man. But I was a teenager, really. And some chap from one of the amateur groups used to bring me here to the theatre. And I was 10 or 11. We came to see Rachel Roberts in Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, which is a very dark, complex play by Edward Albee, an American writer. And I was so young, but seeing Rachel Roberts on that stage and what she could do, the power she was, she lived right near town, Constitution Hill, is it? Her mother had a flat there, and it's right next to where John Chilvers lived, and John ran this theatre. Anyway, I went to see Rachel Roberts at 10 or 11, and I thought, that's it. This is it. This is the only life I want in all the world, is to do what this woman can, not necessarily even to act, but just to be part of the theatre. And then within a few years, John Chilvers befriended me, and I think there were two things. I think he recognised maybe that I was going to be gay, and he recognised that I wanted to be in the theatre, and the two things came together. And he was incredibly kind to me, and I used to go up to visit him, and he would talk to me about the theatre and tell me stories of the theatre, and I was rapt. I was absolutely rapt. And then when I was about 16, I was at Bishop Vaughan School here in Swansea, and I used to work at the Copper Grill to earn money, and I used to work at the Copper Grill all summer long. And the Copper Grill, the head waitress was this wonderful lady, and she was the mum of Keith and Kevin Allen, the Allen boys. Oh heck, what was the mum's name? The dad, Eddie, was the dad, and he worked the Sunrise weekend. And the mum, she was gorgeous. I absolutely loved that woman, and she was the head waitress. And there was a lady, we called her Auntie Jan, and she worked in the bar. And in the summer, Tony, the wine waiter, used to go back to Italy. And I was 16, 17 years old, and I used to be the wine waiter in the summer. It was a very lofty experience. And the woman worked behind the bar. She was called Auntie Jan, and she always used to put her head down, and she used to say to me, "Are my roots showing, boy? Are my roots showing?" And I said, "No, Auntie Jan, they're not showing." And then she'd, "Get them wines out now, boy, get them wines out. Table number 3 is waiting for them wines." And it was theatre as well, because the chef was always like having a conniption in the kitchen. And what was Keith's mum called? Oh God, I can't remember. I can see her face right now in front of me. She'd be Lily Allen's grandma. Anyway, one night John Chilvers came in with a very camp gentleman called Barry Stacey, and Barry Stacey was a London agent. And John had said to me, "I want you to meet Barry Stacey now when he comes down, because Barry Stacey's big up in London." And I was still at school, but dreaming of going to London, hoping to go to drama school. And John brought Barry Stacey in, and I served their table. And Barry Stacey, this is now 1973, I was 17, and Barry Stacey, It was just after decimalisation of Barry Stacey tipped me a pound coin. Well, a pound then was, to me at 17, a lot of money. And Barry Stacey said, look me up when you come to London, kid. And I did. I went along and I went to the Spotlight offices and I sat in a window in the Spotlight office, which is on Charing Cross Road, very noisy traffic, and I did Puck from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And within a few weeks, he got me into a tour of Hair, the show, the rock musical Hair. I was 17 years old and touring in Hair and got my equity ticket. And one of the first venues we played was the Swansea Grand. And my mum and dad were very wary of me going into theatre. I'd left home. I hadn't gone for any further. I hadn't gone to drama school. I'd gone to Tech here to do my A-levels in 1 year. And funny enough, did my A-levels with Keith Allen, strangely enough. And we came to Swansea, and Mum put up about 6 of the cast. We were all sleeping on settees and spare beds and everything. And we came here, but there was this scene they did. There was nudity in Hair, of course, because there was the tribe, and it was all about ban the bomb, peace and love and hippies and nudity. It was an incredible show with the most extraordinary music, and had come from New York, from Joe Papp's famous Public Theatre, which is a beautiful theatre where I've subsequently worked. And it was a musical that shook the world. It was an expression of youth of that time, and it was about liberation and about what youth were looking for. As every generation has something that represents them. Hair was certainly for that generation. But in this production, they'd added a second nude scene in which a youth gets bathed by 2 women in a tin tub. Of course, I was the youth as it happened. Well, my mother, who sat in the front circle with my Auntie Joyce, wasn't my real auntie. Auntie Joyce was a bit like Auntie Jan. She was an invented art. She was my mum's best friend. And her husband had died young. So my dad, my long-suffering dad, often used to come out with Auntie Joyce and my mum. And my mum was terrible. She would talk through everything, and she would make comments on everything. It was embarrassing to be with her. And when they bathed me naked on stage, she turned to my Joyce and said, "Oh my God, Joycey, I can see his dick dock." And my father famously walked out of the theatre. He was so embarrassed. He was so embarrassed by her. Anyway, that was how I got my equity card, and I'm very proud to think. It's hard to believe now. We're talking about 50 years. I think this year or next year I'll be 50 years. Next year. No, this year. I will be 50 years. This summer I'll be 50 years working in the theatre. I've worked in it all my life. And it's great to think that the Grand Theatre was almost my starting point. My starting point as a viewer and my starting point as a performer. So trying to think back, 50 years is a long time to think back, but trying to think back on my work, but also my connection with the Grand, there have been 4 actual times when I worked in the Grand. So that was the first, and the next was I came back in my early 20s. I think I was 21. It was a beautiful hot summer, and I remember spending all the time either at the beach or in this theatre. It was fantastic. And I did 2 plays in Rep, one with Glyn Houston and Eleanor Thomas, who's a lovely Swansea actress, called Shades of Laughter, and another was an Emily Williams play. And it was wonderful because I think it was the last time as a young man, because I'd already left home at 17, it was the last time as a young man I felt really and actually connected to Swansea, was that summer. It was a very important summer in my life, because after that I really moved away, and not only moved away from Swansea but to London, but also then spent a lot of time in America, and then for 10 years I lived in South Africa. And weirdly, the Swansea Grand Theatre and the theatres brought me back, and 3.5 years ago I returned to live here, having left here nearly 50 years ago. It's been astonishing. So I came and I did that summer season, and it was a happy time in my life. So twice the Grand Theatre been in my life now as a performer, as a professional, both very happy circumstances. But what sort of happened for me was that I then went on to get a very fancy agent, a man called Jeremy Conway, who represented a lot of sort of quite big names, and I would be put up for lots of television roles and film roles and everything, and often not quite get there. my big break was I played a Welsh lad in a series called Minder. I'm sure you all know Minder, with Dennis Waterman and George Cole, and I played Dafydd, a darts player. I'm a most unlikely darts player, but I sort of loved being in it. And actually, in a very tiny way, it brought me my first taste of what fame was, because when you're in a series like that on the telly, people recognise you in the street, and builders would wind up and say, "Hey, Dafydd!" As I walked through the streets, it was quite funny, and I thought, God, imagine now you're in one of these series all the time. And actually, that's what that kind of fame is. It consumes you. And that's not what I wanted. I didn't want that. I wanted to be an actor. I desperately wanted to be an actor. I was romantic about it. But it wasn't quite happening. So I started writing. I actually started writing, and I wrote several plays. And then I wrote this play set in Swansea. It was inspired just after my father had died, and I'd watched my mother nursing him. And he'd been in and out of Singleton Hospital. He'd had a series of heart attacks. But actually, he'd sort of died at home. And they'd moved him into the lounge because he couldn't make the stairs anymore. So he was sort of bedridden in the front room downstairs. We lived in Sketty now at this point. And I'd watched her nursing him. It was very moving. And one day I'd been commissioned to write this play, and I was watching the telly. And I was watching the news, the BBC News, and this article came on the news about the number of young people, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, who were carers for single parents with disabilities. And I was so shocked that someone 13, 14-year-old could be looking after their mother. And it made me cry. It was just very moving. And I thought, this is a condition that happens in this country where, with all the wealth we have, we don't seem to have the social services to take care of people sufficiently, and that young children are being forced into that position. You couldn't call it slavery because it was their parents, but you don't know that they love that parent, but they are looking after them and nursing that parent in an extreme condition. And because my mother had just nursed my father into his death, as it were, out of his life, I wrote this play about a mother and daughter, and the mother's got multiple sclerosis, and the daughter is 16 and looks after her. But they've got no money, and they've moved from Neath, and they've come to live in this disused church on the outskirts of Swansea. It's sort of around Town Hill, in quite a poor area. And the girl, you couldn't really call it prostitution, but she goes with boys down the wreck and earns a bit of money. And the play was called A Prayer for Wings, and into my glory, the beautiful and wonderful Joan Playwright, the great actress, who's the wife of Laurence Olivier, she had read this play because her son was doing another one of my plays, happened to be sitting around in their London house, and she read it. I knew her a little bit, and she said, could she direct it? So we did it at the Edinburgh Festival. It had a certain amount of fame and glory. It came to the Bush Theatre, and Joan wasn't free to do it at the Bush. And I did it. I could tell you the story of how I did it. Should I tell the story of how I did it? It's a good showbiz story, actually. So I'd written these two plays. I'd written several plays that had been on, and I'd written these two plays which were both on at Edinburgh Festival at the same time. One was called Infidelities and starred Jill Bennett, and the other was A Prayer for Wings, directed by Joan, starred Patty Love, who was a wonderful actress, and Prayer for Wings was set in Swansea. Anyway, both these plays got a certain amount of attention, and Prayer for Wings won a Fringe First Award, and Infidelities won the Perrier Pick of the Fringe Award and came to the Donmar Warehouse in London, and Prayer for Wings came to the Bush Theatre. And lots of people came to see it. It was a sort of one of those glorious moments. It was on the Fringe, but it was still talk of the town, and everyone was saying, who is this young writer? And it was a big sort of moment, a kind of a baptism in my life. And I was suddenly chased by lots of people, maybe to do movies or maybe going to the West End, or various stars who wanted my work. And one of the stars who chased me was a lady called Faye Dunaway. And Faye Dunaway decided she wanted to be in a play of mine. So these two plays, Infidelities and The Prayer for Wings, the scripts were dispatched by courier to Faye Dunaway. And she called me up and said how brilliant they were, and all she wanted to do was she wanted to work with me. Now, at the time, she lived with a fantastic photographer called Terry O'Neill, and I lived with a fantastic actor called Ian McKellen. And so a dinner was arranged at the Caprice in London. Now, this was heady stuff for me. I lived with Ian McKellen. He was 17 years older than me. And everything was about Ian McKellen. It wasn't about Sean Mathias. It really wasn't. I was a youngster trying to make my way. So all of this sudden attention and awards, and it was all new to me, and it was thrilling, but it was very daunting. Anyway, we went to the Caprice for dinner, and I was waiting to find out because the play Preference was coming to the Bush Theatre, but there was a question mark of whether Joan Playwright could direct it, whether she was free or not. She was going to do a play at the National. And I had to go to we didn't have mobile phones, there was a telephone, there was an old black, like 1930s sort of Hollywood movie telephone on the staircase of the Caprice on the way down to the Louvre. And I had to go at 11 p.m. and call Joan Playwright. Now, everyone at the table, that's Faye Dunaway, Terry O'Neill and Ian McKellen, knew that this phone call was going to take place. So I went down to the telephone, I called, and Joan came to the phone and she said, I can't do it, the dates clash with the National. I said, oh, that's such a disappointment, but anyway, thank you. I put the phone and went back. Well, they said, well. I said, she can't do it. There was a pause, and Faye Dunaway looked across the table and said, you must do it. I said, what do you mean? You must direct that play. And that's how I started directing, thanks to Faye bloody Dunaway. I went to the Bush Theatre and I said, I want to do it. And they looked at me a bit askance and they said, all right then, you can do it, but we've got the producers who run the Bush Theatre, it was Jenny Topper and Simon Stokes, both done extremely well in the theatre. So we got to sit in on the design meetings because you never direct a play. I said, that's fair enough, you can guide me through that. So they did that and I directed a play and that was it. I started directing and directing took over and writing started to take a bit of a backseat, and which was a sadness for me because I loved writing. It was very hard, very lonely, very, very, very lonely. But I think of all the things I've done in my life, writing is a thing that connects me deeper to my truth than anything else I've done. Because directing is an extraordinary talent, and I hated it at first because you've got to be very organised. And I was scatty, I'm still a bit scatty, but very organised. And for a man, sorry to use these terms, which we're not allowed to use anymore, but slightly patriarchal, because you've got to, or you could be matriarchal if you wanted to be, but you've got to somehow take control of the situation and look after people. So it's a little bit, for me, directing, it's intellectual, it's a little bit, it's academic, a little bit almost like being in the army. There's all these different qualities. I didn't think I had any of them, really. I was quite good with actors, and I was good visually. I could envision things, so I was good with design, and I was good with, I loved literature, so I was good with the writer, I was good with the actors, and I was good with the design, but I didn't like the whole big thing, and I was sad about not writing because I started getting directing offers. I never had offers like this before. I was getting directed, so basically I stopped acting. That's how I came to stop acting, and for quite a long time came to stop writing, but not entirely. And my directing career was launched by pure chance, by the fact that I'd been a writer, and thanks to, well, in part thanks to Faye Dunaway's chutzpah. Some years later, when would it have been? Now that's where dates are elusive. I think I did my first Broadway show in the mid-90s. Yeah, that would be about right. I was about 38. I was just under 40. And my directing career had really, really taken off. Now, Faye Dunaway I never found that famous play for her to do. But I was doing this show I'd done at the National Theatre. It was a play by a man called Jean Cocteau, brilliant French artist. He was brilliant because he was a photographer, a writer, a composer, an artist, a painter, and a playwright, and he made movies. And used to make movies and show his movies with music, which not many people had done at that time. And he was a huge self-publicist. So, a very big, important artist in France, but not so well known here. He wrote a seminal book for all French youth called Les Enfants Terribles, which was all about these rebellious youth. And it had been such a success. He wrote a play called Les Parents Terribles, which actually doesn't mean the terrible parents. It means more the terrifying parents. And it was a wonderful play that Richard Eyre asked me to direct at the National Theatre, and I did it at the National was Sheila Gish, Francis Latour, Alan Howard, Jude Law. Jude Law's not quite debut, and Lindsay Baxter. And then they asked me to do it in America. And it was actually another good story, because on the last night of it at the National Theatre, it was on in the Littleton Theatre. It had a lot of attention. It was been great, and a terrific success. It was one of those kind of breakout moments in my life, like Prayer for Wings had been at the Edinburgh Festival. It was a big breakout moment. And on the last night, the Schuberts, there was two very powerful organisations in New York, the Schuberts and the Nederlanders. And between these two organisations, they owned all the Broadway houses, bar maybe one or two. And the Schuberts, who owned probably 20 Broadway houses, flew in to see this production on the very last night at the National Theatre, because the Variety had given it an absolute rave review. It might not have been the last night, maybe it wasn't. Anyway, it was towards the end of the run. By chance, that night, who's in the audience? Princess Margaret. So in the VIP room, there's the Schuberts and Princess Margaret and various others seeing this production, which has been much talked about in London. And the Schuberts are there with the express interest of would they take it to Broadway. Well, I don't really know what's going on. I'm sort of probably drunk by now because I'm out of my mind with excitement, and it's another, as I say, breakthrough moment where you think, I can't believe this is really happening, and to go to Broadway, it was like... Anyway, Princess Margaret, who's famously tricky, I could say, maybe, and socially quite sort of outspoken, liked a bit of a tipple, loved to smoke and everything. And there were 2 intervals to this play, very unusual, so we had to meet in the VIP room twice with all these people. So, as a director, you're kind of under pressure. Well, is the show going well? Do they like it? That's all you really care about. Do they like it? Do they like it? Do they like my work? And so you're nervous. And Princess Margaret couldn't have been better. She asked me lots of questions. She was fascinated by the play. She was very charming. So the first interval had gone really well. And the second interval, I'd gotten waylaid to come into this VIP room. And when I arrived a bit late, Princess Margaret sort of held her arms and went, "Here he comes, our marvellous director." So I thought, oh my God, it's almost like I've hired her for the night to be my publicist, because the Schuberts did pick the play up and they took it to Broadway. And when we were thank you, Princess Margaret, for that. Thank you very much. When we were on Broadway, one of the names that was talked about to play the sister, the part that Francis Latour played, was Faye Dunaway. So I said, well, I know Faye Dunaway, but I haven't seen her for a while. But we'd stayed in touch for quite a bit. And they said, well, why don't we, would you like to have a meeting with her? I said, I'd love to, yeah, because they were a bit nervous about just offering it to her, because Faye Dunaway did have a reputation for being tricky, to say the least. So she was in LA, so they flew me out to LA, and I had lunch with Faye Dunaway. And it was just actually really lovely to see her. I'd grown, my career had taken off. She'd been there earlier days. Her career was in a very strange place, because she's a brilliant actress and an Oscar winner and part of Hollywood royalty, but she'd done this film, Mommy Dearest, where she played Joan Crawford, and her career had really subsided after that. In fact, weirdly, I watched Mommy Dearest this week. It's so strange that Faye Dunaway. I'm gonna run into her now when I leave the Grand Theatre, because I don't know why she's in the zeitgeist there. But her career sort of subsided, so she was working in the theatre and looking for stuff in the theatre and looking for work. And she was absolutely lovely, but she decided she wasn't quite right for it, and I think probably that was just as well, because it was a difficult play and a difficult role, and the very brilliant Eileen Atkins took the role on Broadway, and she was sensational. And Eileen Atkins is a totally well-versed, hugely experienced, very talented stage actress, and that was right. But and I have run into Faye Dunaway once or twice since then, but I haven't stayed in touch. But she's part of my history. I think what was the real conundrum probably in my life, or the conflict, was directing work offers came easily to me when nothing before that had acting acting hadn't, auditions hadn't, getting acting roles hadn't, writing hadn't, because writing is such a personal thing, although my writing was starting to take off. But directing just absolutely took off. But the conflict was how difficult I found it. And I'd be offered work and I didn't want to do it. And that was tough, because then you feel like you're being a brat. You feel like you're not being grateful for what you've been offered. And it was just that I didn't feel up to. I didn't feel. It gave me anxiety. It made me anxious. It was a huge responsibility. Whereas I'd come into the theatre in a more sort of bohemian way, thinking I was an artist, and I'd have a laugh, and it'd be romantic, and it'd be fun, and I'd be on tour, and I'd be in plays, and all those things, which is true. And of course, the reality is it's very hard work as well, and there's a lot of unemployment as well, and economically it's challenging. But there is a romantic side to being an actor. Is freer in a sense than a director. A director carries endless, the shoulders are weighed down with responsibility. But I think my great fortune was that there have been several people who've helped me and mentored me. Ian McKellen, certainly, being one of them, in that I've learned so many things from Ian. As a partner, we lived together for 9 years. But as a practitioner, we've done, it's countless productions. More than you can count on two hands anyway, and that's a lot to do with one person. But my big break was going to the National Theatre at a time when Richard Eyre was running the National Theatre, because Richard Eyre was one of the great impresarios of our time, and he brought into the National Theatre an incredible array of very talented young emerging directors, designers, writers, actors. He really was a genuine impresario in that he could put all these different people together. He had this taste and wisdom and daring do, and I was lucky enough to be one of his directors, and I did 5 productions, I think, for him there over the space of 6, 7, 8 years. And he would always mentor you through the productions. He'd give you notes. You'd come to see a run-through. You'd be then called up to his office. You get notes. His notes were very precise, sometimes very tough. He expected you to do them. You didn't have to do them. You were the director, but he was the boss. And then he'd come to the first preview, or maybe sometimes to a dress rehearsal, more notes. Then he'd come to another preview, more notes, and he made you work and work and work on it till the opening night. And I think I had 5 very successful shows with him. And he believed in me, and he helped me, and he guided me. And then one of the shows we were going to plan to do at the National was a play by Noah Cowell called Design for Living. We didn't do for various reasons. But as the National let it go, Sam Mendes, who ran the Donmar at that time, picked it up. And he also I only did 2 shows with Sam, but he also became and he was younger than me, or is younger than me, should I say. But he was also a very kind and wonderful producer, and very helpful and very loving. And it's that nurturing spirit of those men that helped me grow. And then the third person was the Schuberts, Jerry Schoenfeld, who came that night to see that play in London with Princess Margaret in attendance, became my American godfather. I've done 10 shows for the Schuberts on Broadway. And Jerry sadly passed away. I was very close to him, very, very close. I adored that man. He passed away, but the Schuberts have been, I've stayed in I haven't worked in America because we've had a pandemic. But up until 2017, I think I did 5 or 6 shows in that decade, up until 2017, and I'd done shows much earlier on. So I had 2 big periods working in New York, with a big break in between. But it's nearly all been for the Schuberts. Not completely. I worked at the Public Theatre. I've worked at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. I've worked at Berkeley Rep out in San Francisco, which is an incredible spot. I worked a bit off Broadway as well. I've done 10 or 12. I've probably done more than 12 American productions, and more than 30 British productions, I guess, coming up to about 50 productions. So the Schubert, Jerry Schoenfeld also was a tremendous mentor. I mean, just looked after me, and he wouldn't even negotiate with my agent, just say, I'm going to give Sean this, I'm going to give Sean, when no other producer would have given me the kind of money he was giving me. I started to make money. That's how I first made some money, was working for the Schuberts in New York. New York pays directors a lot more money than UK. For a start, you get a hefty fee, and part of that fee is an advance against royalties. So if the show runs and the royalties come in, you have to pay off that advance, and then you get more royalties. But the purpose of that is that you get a proper sum guaranteed up front. You don't get that in Britain. You get a small sum up front, and it's hard to be a director in Britain. It's hard, unless you do, and I've never done those big commercial shows. I've never done Les Miserables, etc. So I've been reliant on doing individual shows, and Jerry was very, very kind and helped get me into a different economic bracket, as it were. Helped me get success as a director, thanks to my talent, of course. But he was wonderful, a wonderful character. So it's people like that, and I can't see how anyone can survive without help in our business. The theatre is actually I've worked in film as well, not much, but the theatre is a very, on the whole, friendly, loving place. It's changing in front of our eyes because it's become more and more commercialised over the past decade. But on the whole, most of the people that I worked in the theatre have been really good people. I wrote a film, an adaptation for the BBC, for Screen 2, which is a wonderful film channel, as it were, and I wrote a film called The Lost Language of Cranes, which was an adaptation of a novel. It was actually a novel set in New York, but the author gave permission for us to change it to London, and I wrote this film called The Lost Language of Cranes, which is a very important film about coming out as a gay man. And I was able, as the writer, to promote the fact that I was a gay man and I had come out to my family, and it was this was back, 1990, 1991 maybe. It's very important at that point to give coming out a context and language, because it wasn't, we've moved on, that's 30 years ago, we've moved on hugely since then, but the legalities of life were very, very different at that point. There wasn't equality. There was no legal equality. So coming out was a very important step in the history of gay politics. And this film was a wonderful film, and I loved writing for it. But the director was he was called Nigel Finch, and he ran a brilliant documentary series called Arena, which was a big BBC series. And he was a genius. He was a very clever man, and he was a visionary, and he was a cameraman. But he wasn't vaguely interested in actors. He was interested in language and the script and the screenplay. He and the script editor gave me hell on the screenplay. He used to come around to my flat and bully me for 12 hours at a time, and they really taught me how to craft the script, because it was sprawling and all over the place. They were wonderful, but he wasn't good with the actors. And it was Brian Cox and Eileen Atkins were the two leads, and there was a wonderful boy called Angus McFadden, an American boy called Corey Parker, and John Schlesinger, the movie director, played a cameo in it. Anyway, he let me have free rein on the set with the actors and given the actors notes and help. So it was another important step into me becoming a director and maybe thinking I'd like to direct film. And then some years later I'd done Bent, another very famous gay play about the persecution of gay men in Nazi Germany. I'd done it at the National Theatre for Richard Eyre and a man called David Orkin, and David Orkin was the executive producer, and he then went on to work at Film 4, and they asked me to make a movie of this for Film 4, Channel 4, and we had Japanese money and some other bit of independent money. We made a movie of the film with Clive Owen, Lotte Bluto, Ian McKellen, Mick Jagger, Jude Law as a small part, Rachel Weisz as a small role, Brian Webber, South African actor. And I just loved the experience. I loved it. I loved it from beginning to end. And I think it was when you do a play, no matter what, you're collaborating, or you should be collaborating constantly. And even when the production, even if you are more of an auteur, the production is at the hands, or the mercy, of the performers and the audience and the chemistry of those two nightly. And it can change in small and subtle ways, or depending on the director who gives it the freedom, it could change in bigger ways. When you do a film, you've got the ultimate power, apart from the money people, of course. They've always got the ultimate power, but you've got the ultimate power artistically because you're in the editing room with the editor and you're shaping and fashioning their performances, your story, the style of the film. And we actually cut bent on film. It was actually, and I can't remember the name of the machine, but it's an incredible old machine. And the editor was a lovely French lady called Isabelle Laurent, wore these white gloves, and she would literally splice the film, put it together. It took forever. Everyone said filming would be exhausting, and I got in my mind, it is tiring. You get up very early, and I'm not a great morning person, but it's exhilarating. But editing is exhausting because your brain and your concentration are exerted day after day, hour after hour. Some directors don't go to the whole edit. Some directors pop in and out. Some directors leave the editor to do it. Of course, now I've just made my second film after 25-year break, thinking I'd never do another one. And now editing's totally different because it's so. All the tools are, in software and hardware, and you just go in and you can change things instantaneously. But the feeling that I own it, it's mine, is there still. And so I've done I've written one film and written one film that was made. I've written several films that weren't made. And I've directed 2 films, and I've loved doing them both, loved the process. And I'd like to do more. I've got another one on offer. I'm hoping to do it this year, please God. But it's a different sort of experience. I feel, in some strange way, more of an artist when I do a film. I feel as a director that I'm having in the theatre. Not. I love collaborating. I've not got problems with collaborating. I love listening to other people, and I love. Including other people, but I feel in some way that I'm there. I feel more the servant as a theatre director, more as the powerful artist as a film director. Yeah, I mean, I think what I probably enjoy most in the theatre is rehearsals. I love rehearsals. That's when I feel I'm at my most creative. And I like to think that I push the actors. I'm quite tough, but I like to think I'm also inspiring and I'm fun. Let's hope. And have a good atmosphere in rehearsals. I think the rehearsal room is a place where you are free to experiment. And that's a bit I love. I love experimenting. The hardest thing probably is about the theatre is letting it go. Once it goes onto the stage and you've got through the first previews or you're making all your adjustments and you say, well, that's it, that's more or less set. Then you have to go away. Sometimes you have to leave that city, go to another city. Sometimes you leave that country, get on a plane, go to another country, and you might not see it for a while. Although I do try and go back and see my shows as often as possible. I sometimes see them 2 or 3 times a week. And some directors go to every performance. They are very rare. And some directors never go back. They are rare as well. Most of us are somewhere in between. I probably go more often than not. But the difficult thing is allowing it to grow. And by that I mean with an audience, and actors grow in confidence as they go along, the more performances they do, and the more they discover. If it's a wonderful script, you keep making discoveries. It's unending. It's a bottomless pit. When we did Waiting for Godot, Samuel Beckett, I mean, you just couldn't believe the play we were doing, I think nearly 4 years later than when we started, because we'd learned so much more about it, because the text is that's an abstract text, so you've got so many different possible interpretations, idioms, meanings, subtleties, nuances, poetries. But any really good script will have depths, and you'll find more and more as you go along, up to a point, and then maybe you come to a point and you say, do you know what, I can't do this play anymore, and that's fine, then you stop doing it. But as a director, you go back, and the actors have been finding things out, and often really good, and sometimes not so good, and sometimes you think, you can't do that, you've gone too far, that's too heavy-handed, that's too clumsy, that's actually just not right. That's not what my idea of the play was, what we've always talked about. And so you've got to confront that. And generally it's usually worse with comedy, because what will happen is actors will sense a laugh, sniff out a laugh, and get that laugh. It's nothing more enchanting than being in the theatre and you hear an audience laughing at an actor's brilliance and dazzling talent. But it's not always right, not always necessarily right for the play. And generally when I've been in disagreement with actors is when I feel they've gone too far in the wrong direction. It's usually because they're being tarts, basically, and playing to the crowd, usually that. And of course, if you're doing a show and it's a long run, I mean, I haven't done big commercial shows, but I've done plays that have run for 6 months, sometimes 9 months. Obviously, the longer it's on, the more the actors feel they own it, and not you. You don't feel you own it. You, the director, don't feel you own it. Which again, in film, you always feel you own it, because that's it. That's that finished product. I mean, you share. I'm not suggesting you don't share these things. You do. You collaborate on everything, film and theatre. But it's just that different sense of when a film is complete, it's complete. A play is never really completed, and an actor like Ian McKellen, he never stops working. He changes things continuously. Sometimes there are fisticuffs over this, because changes. I don't think it's fair for an actor to make a big change without consulting with the director. Not because the director's in a sense of power or the boss, but because you're collaborators, you're partners. I think you don't change things. You don't make a radical change without checking with your partner. You don't just take the dog out and give it a dyeing pink without asking your partner, what do you think about dyeing the dog pink, do you? I mean, that's just normal stuff. Or you don't send your kid off to a different school without discussing with your partner. So I think that these things should be discussed. If they're radical, if they're minor, of course. But when we did a little night music at the National Theatre, it was a fantastic cast. Judy Dench played Desiree. And she's, of course, probably the most famous interpreter of Stephen Sondheim's song "Send in the Clowns." She's been asked to sing it continuously since that production. Sian Phillips was in it, our wonderful own Welsh Sian Phillips. She actually played Judy Dench's mother, and she's about 3 years older than she. I don't know what it is, but they're very close in age. And the wonderful Patricia Hodge played the Countess. And it had a stunning cast, but those 3 ladies were particularly prominent in it. And it was one of those shows that Richard Eyre, who produced at the National, and he gave me a lot of notes through previews. But he said, I remember him saying to me, he said, you know what, Sean, this show is really, really good, but if you keep working and you fix this list, it was like a house with all the problems in. You fix this list, this show's going to be great. And anyway, he was right. We fixed all the problems. The show was great. The show got great notices. And it ran for months and months and months and months. It was still selling so many tickets that they did I don't think they'd done this before. They took it out of the repertoire and put it in for a straightforward run. So it would run every night, because normally at the National Theatre you do 3 or 4 performances of one show, then into that same theatre comes another show for 3 or 4 performances. And that's the whole point of repertoire. You have a choice. The audience has a great selection of different things, and the actor doesn't get bored because they're only playing the same show 3 or 4 nights a week, if that, not 8 times a week. But at the end of this, they wanted to do a little night music. I think it was 6 weeks. We played 6 weeks, 8 shows a week. And it was, I think I'd been away. I'd been to see it many, many, many times. It was at the same time I was directing Bent. I was directing my first film. There was a lot going on. And I'd had my first show on Broadway. It was all within the same year. It was a heady 12 months. And I'd been away, and we were in the last 6 weeks. And I think we were in maybe the last week, and I went to see the show. And I went round, I had some notes. I thought, I don't know, not sure about that. And I went round and I went to Judy Dench's dressing room first, and I went in and said, hello, how are you? And chatted, and it was all very nice. And I said, you know, when you do that, and you do that, why don't you... And she looked at me and said, thank you very much. And that was it. And I went to Patricia Hodges' dressing room and I said, do you know when you do so-and-so and you do so-and-so and so-and-so, why don't you... And she looked at me and said, I don't think so, Sean. And then I went to Sian Phillips' dressing room and I said the same thing, you know when you do... And she said, Sean, it's too late. It's just too late. And so I knew then that I'd lost that little battle, that they'd all gone way beyond in their experience of doing this show. It was part of their DNA, and basically I was just an intruder. They put me in my place. So my tail between my legs, I walked off, and that was that. So you wouldn't have that on film, see? You wouldn't have that on film. I'd have the last laugh. Yes, well, all the different, relationships one's had in the theatre. Sian Phillips, one of them. We did a show about Marlene Dietrich, which we went on tour all over the country. Took to Ireland, took to France, took to New York. We did Little Night Music. I first met Sian, we did Ghosts. In a version by Pam Jens, we did a Welsh ghost. It was not in the Welsh language, but we set it in Wales. Did it at the Sherman Theatre. We took it to the Torch. I think we took it. Did we take it to Clwyd? Anyway, we did a lot. And I hadn't done a play with Sian for years and years. And I did a play with her last year, a play by Enid Bagnall called The Chalk Garden. So that's 4 shows I've done with Sian. Ian, I've done. I can't even count them. I'd have to stop and count them. But it's between 12 and 15, I think now, if you include film as well. But he did a one-man, he decided when he was turning 80, which was in 2019, he wanted to do one-man, he'd been commissioned to write his biography, and he'd been given an awful lot of money, and he was writing his biography, and it was making him utterly miserable. He didn't enjoy doing it at all, so he gave them back all the money, and decided to write a one-man show, which was very autobiographical. And I think it suited him more. I think he didn't like dredging up the memories and seeing them on the page, whereas dredging up the memories and sharing them with the audience, because more than anyone, him and Judy Dench are the two people that I can't believe what they're like on stage. They're just so at home on stage. They just love the audience and get the audience to love them. It's an incredible gift. I mean, it applies to many actors, but those are the two that spring to mind the most. And so he wrote this one-man show, and he did it for a small theatre in London called the Park Theatre to raise money for them, and he raised £250,000 for them, which was incredibly generous of him. He did it for some weeks, and I went to see it. It was fantastic. And he said, I've decided I want to do this in 80 venues around the UK to celebrate my 80th birthday, and in each venue the box office takings will go to that venue, so it'll be a charitable enterprise. And he asked me to direct it, and I said, well, you don't really need me, you've done it, it's wonderful. He said, no, I want to change things. And so we started meeting and talking about it, and developing it, and having ideas, and cutting and tailoring it, and I came up with a sort of a physical concept for it to have a sort of setting. And we set off, we did it in, I think, about 8 different theatres in London, including the National Theatre. And the first started where he lives, in the East End, on the lovely tiny theatre on the Isle of Dogs. It went to the Vic, but it went to 75 theatres around the country, one of the theatres being the Grand Theatre. So that was my third working. It was only one night only the Grand Theatre. Happened to be it was 2019, and March the 14th, 2019, Ian McKellen on stage at 80 at the Grand Theatre. It was my birthday, 63rd birthday. And I'd been asked to come down to talk to the Grand about doing my play, A Prayer for Wings, that play that Joan Playwright had directed all those years ago. Couldn't do it at the Bush Theatre. Faye Dunaway had said, you should do it. It was being done. It'd been done here at the Taliesin, and it had been done up in Clwyd, but it had never been done by me in Swansea, and it had never been done in a Swansea production on its own. I think the Taliesin production had been a tour. So the Grand wanted me to do it as part of the 50th anniversary of Swansea being a city. So I came down for the show that I directed with Ian McKellen on stage, and to talk to the theatre. And so we did Ian's show, packed to the rafters, wonderful, wonderful response. It was a wonderful show everywhere we went. He got a great response. It was he included the audience almost like, he did a bit of panto in it, but he included the audience like the way you do in panto. It was very warm, very heartfelt, very humane show. And at the end of it, he introduced me and the audience sang Happy Birthday to me in the Grand Theatre. It doesn't come much better than that when you started off 6 years old, wanted the panto, and there you are, 63 years old, being sung Happy Birthday to. It was lovely. And from that, we did my play, Prayer for Wings, that summer, but we didn't do it. It was a Grand Theatre production, and we did it at the Volcano, which is up on the High Street, which is this wonderful art centre. Because the play is set in a disused church, and they're very, very poor. They're squatters, basically. The Volcano lent itself. The atmosphere was brilliant for that. And we transferred to the King's Head in London, and it was the first transfer of the Grand Theatre to a London theatre in 100 years. We can challenge that fact, but that's what I was told at the time, and it was in the press at the time. Anyway, that's my fourth time at the Grand. Once in rep, once with my own production as a director of my own work as a writer. Once on tour as the director of Ian McKellen, and my debut on tour, getting my equity ticket in Hare. So now I'm looking forward to my fifth production at the Grand, and I hope it'll be soon. Yeah, there's a play called No Man's Land that I'd always wanted to do. It was a play by Harold Pinter. And when I was very, very young, I think about 18, I'd been at the opening night at the Old Vic in London, and it was directed by Peter Hall. And the two older leads were John Gielgud and Rafe Richardson. And it was absolutely extraordinary. But a bit like when I saw Rachel Roberts here at 11 or 12, seeing John Gielgud and Rafe Richardson together on stage was an extraordinary experience. Their dexterity and their charm and their personalities and their expertise, and in this very totally weird but fascinating play, completely difficult to fathom. And I remember coming to the interval and being completely blown away, and I stood up to leave my seat, and sat right behind me was Catherine Hepburn, and thinking, this can't be happening, this can't actually be a reality. In one night, there's those two up there, and Catherine Hepburn right behind me here, these legendary talents, because that's what they were, immense talents. Anyway, years later, I tried to do this play, and I tried to interest Ian McKellen in it. He kept saying, I don't get it, I don't understand it, no, it's not for me, I don't want to do it. And then I'd done Godot with Ian and Patrick, and Patrick said, could we have dinner one night? And I said, absolutely. This is after the production of Godot had finished. In fact, we went on to do Godot, and Roger Rees took over from Patrick, and we went on to tour to Australia and New Zealand, and then we brought it to South Africa. We even played in a township in South Africa, which was extraordinary. Patrick had left the production at this point, and so we went for dinner, and he said, I want to do a play with you. And I said, what is it? He said, No Man's Land. I said, God, that's weird. I love No Man's Land. I've tried to do it many times over and over. I would love to do it with you. Who do you want to play? He said, Hurst, which was the part that Rafe Richardson played. I said, who do you want to play Spooner? He said, Ian. I said, oh, Ian won't do it. He said, what do you mean? And I said, well, I've tried to interest him several times. I've brought this play to him over a number of years. I've brought it, at different times when he's been in different frames of mind, and I've tried my timing, to see if I can seduce him into it. He's always said no. I think it's a no-go. And then I said, maybe what we could do is maybe we should do a reading of it. I'm sure you'd do a reading for us, get him to read it, and maybe that will sort of seduce him into it. He said, okay. And then my partner had an incredible idea. He said, because Ian and I were talking about doing Godot on Broadway. We'd finished doing it in England and in these other countries, but we hadn't done it in New York. And my partner said to me, if Ian wants to do Godot again and Patrick wants to do No Man's Land, why don't you play them one against the other and do both plays? I said, that's a very curious idea, because although there's a boy in Godot, both plays are four-handers, 2 older men, 2 younger men, potentially that way. And that's how the idea was born. And we did the reading. We were in Milton Keynes. Ian and I were doing a play called The Syndicate by Edoardo Di Filippo. And we were in Milton Keynes, and we sat in it, and Patrick lived in Oxford, and just close by in the countryside, and we sat in the dressing room in Milton Keynes, and we read this play with 2 other actors, both from the company of The Syndicate, the play we were performing that night on stage. And we all sat around roaring with laughter. We just thought this play was bloody hysterical. And that was it. Ian saw what a great role it was, and what a fun play it was, and what a strange play it was. And he was hooked, and that was where the idea for doing Godot and No Man's Land in repertoire on Broadway was born. And in fact, the 3 of us co-produced it with some other producers there in America, the wonderful Stuart Thompson, who was a brilliant producer and also a great friend and mentor. And we hadn't done No Man's Land, so we started it out in Berkeley, at Berkeley Rep in California. We did it on its own as a run. So then when we brought it to New York, we brought it together with Godot. And eventually we brought No Man's Land to England, because it had never played England, in our production, at the Wyndham Theatre. Anyway, when we started out doing it, we were in New York, and Patrick, who'd wanted to do it for so long, was so well prepared. He was absolutely brilliant. He'd got the character so sorted out, knew a lot of his lines. He was almost ready to open. He was so good as the character. And Ian was kind of all over the place, experimenting, being poetic. Patrick played the more stiff, rigid character, and Ian played the more flowery, weird character. And I was encouraging Ian to be flowery and to be weird and to be experimental. And Patrick became more and more intractable, because he just felt that what he was doing was right, and I could see he didn't like what Ian was doing. And every day rehearsals became so tense and difficult, and Patrick was just grumpy, and I was shouting at Patrick, and it was all a bit of a nightmare. I thought, this is a disaster. And then I put my back out, and I was in terrible pain, and it was 35 degrees in New York in the summer, and it was miserable. Anyway, we finished, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks rehearsal, and then we were going off to California for another week or two's rehearsal. And we got to California, and the atmosphere was entirely different, and we were away from the city and away from the tension. The weather was much better. And I remember thinking, why is this play not coming together? Why isn't it? Ian's really struggling to find his character. Patrick is brilliant, but he's sort of on his own. He's isolated. And then I thought about all the plays that Pinter had been in when he was a young man, a young actor, and he'd been in Rep, and he'd been in all these plays of a certain period. A lot of plays at that time were in 3 acts with 2 intervals. But he'd been in plays of a certain, drawing room type plays, a certain mannerism. And I thought, of course, it's very abstract, so you could sort of go down, you could probably do it in many different productions. And I thought, no, we should do it just as a drawing room play. It should be completely mannered, and it should be masked, and everything should be behind a mannerism. So I went into work, and I said to them, right, it's a whole new set of rules. You're only allowed to do this much expression. You can't be free. You can't go wandering. We've got to be very choreographed. We've got to be very tight. We've got to be very disciplined. It's got to be very, very mannered. They all looked at me and they thought, because it's kind of great when the director has one idea at least. They think, oh God, thank God, Sean's had an idea. So they thought, yeah, that's great. So we started doing it as an exercise. Fell into place. Rhythms happening, performances happening, people meeting or colliding or not meeting in just the right way. And it started to glide and it was smooth. And then I started to say, you can't move there, don't move there, you mustn't move there, stay still, don't touch that table. And it became I became almost like, the conductor with the metronome. And they were fine. They were so glad because it had been so wayward and it was like a bonfire. And suddenly it was all controlled and neat and dazzling. And it was only a few days to go before performance, and we opened and the audience just laughed, and it was a comedy. It was a comedy, and I think I didn't know just what a comedy it was and what a most brilliant play. And it ended up being, I think, one of the happiest jobs I've ever done. And they loved playing it because it would grow and it would change a little, but not much. Basically, you could play it the same way every night, get the same responses, and they could glide on it, and they'd come off and they were full of energy. They were never exhausted. They felt upbeat, and so it just was a wonderfully happy experience, and I'm thrilled we were able to bring it to London. Absolutely thrilled. And in fact, I think we're going to record it for Vox. Yeah. Not quite radio, but for audio. Like Audible books, they're going to do some Audible plays. There's a new company doing that. I think we're going to do No Man's Land.